Welcome to English 4E. This is class 17, and today we're going to be working on assignments K23 and K24. We are in Unit 2, and I am Jillian Percy. Oh, contact information. Okay. If you are trying to reach me, email is really the best way, jillian.percy@nnecschools.org. You can also reach me on Facebook, capital G, capital P, ERCY, space, capital W, AHSA. I also have a YouTube channel with the exact same address. If you're trying to listen to previous classes, that is where you would go. And if you need to talk to me while I'm on air, 1-800-465-7144. And the office number is 1-800-667-3703. If you are sending assignments, please send them to studentwork@nnec.on.ca. That way they're in the system. And if something happened to me and another teacher took over the class, it would be there for them to access as well. Always include your name, the course name, the assignment number, and the name. I teach 4 classes and there's lots of other teachers here, so that way we keep all the assignments going to the right place. Okay, so today's work. Review how to do the chapter questions, look at and discuss chapter 2, examine the questions for chapter 2, look at how to do the journals on the chapters, go through the process steps for writing, and role model creating your own journal review and practice our editing skills. I don't know if we'll get to practicing our editing skills, but hopefully we will. We'll see. Okay. So yesterday we talked about key question 23, and we're going to talk about it again in a few minutes, but one of the things about these particular assignments in Unit 2 is the first 2 are very long here, and you're going to have to be kind of working on them throughout this particular unit. So we're going to go back and forth a little bit, which we don't normally do, but just because it's in the nature of a novel study, we kind of have to do for this. So these chapter reflections are worth 30 marks altogether. Okay. The expectations we're meeting are we're demonstrating an understanding of the text by citing explicit information and ideas from it, describing how your own different values and perspectives might influence the way you respond to and interpret texts, and construct a variety of complete and correct sentences. Okay, as you're reading through the novel, Where the Rivers Meet, you will reflect upon the content of any 6 chapters of your choice with a journal response. You will have the opportunity to express your opinion, your thoughts, your feelings on what you have been reading. When you are done with this assignment, you should have a series of 6 responses, 1 for each chapter you've chosen. I think this novel has been like 15 or 16 chapters. You do not have to do this for every chapter. You just have to pick 6 of them, okay? Remember that each response will be a paragraph consisting of at least 5 sentences. And remember to focus on good subject-verb agreement and also try to use some adjectives and adverbs to add variety to your writing. Okay, how to get started. Obviously, our first step is to read the chapter in question. I don't normally read novels with the idea that I'm going to be responding to them, right? If I'm just reading for fun, I just read. I don't worry about it. But when I'm reading a novel for a class and I know that I'm going to have to make a response to something I'm reading, I often keep a small notebook or a piece of paper to write down notes about ideas that come to me as I'm reading. And this assignment specifically asks about your opinion on what you read. So some possible parts of each chapter to think about are, what do you think of the main characters' actions or their feelings or the situation they're in or their dialogue? Like, what are they saying to people? What do you think about other characters' actions, feelings, situation, or dialogue? What do you think about the town they're in? What do you think about the school? Okay. So how can we make writing a reading response journal easier? Some people find doing these kind of journals somewhat hard because they feel like they don't think about anything while they're reading. I don't think that's really true, but I think sometimes our thoughts are going so fast, we're not really aware of them. And what we're trying to do is sort of slow ourselves down so that we become more aware of our thoughts, okay? I'm going to talk here about some different reading strategies they're really just thinking strategies. And we use these kind of strategies every day, just kind of walking around doing our own stuff. But again, we're not necessarily aware of those thoughts. And it's kind of a challenging thing sometimes to sort of step back and look at our own thoughts. And that's what we're kind of asking you to do. Here are some common strategies that people use when understanding what they read. They can activate their background knowledge. They can make connections from the text to themselves, or from the text to other books, or text to the world. They can make predictions about what's going to happen in the novel to the characters. They could ask questions before, during, and after the reading about, again, the characters, the decisions, the choices that are going on. They can monitor for understandings. That's a big one. Hopefully that everybody is doing that. If you're ever reading and you're like, oh my gosh, that makes no sense, I always make sure to stop and reread to make sure I didn't miss something that would help it make more sense. Make inferences or deductions about what you read. Prioritize information, which is like try and figure out what is important versus what is not so important, and then summarize what you read. Now, we're not going to get a chance to talk about all of those strategies today, but I am going to try and talk about them a little bit this week. So you've got them as you're doing your reading. I'm assuming some people might be doing some reading on their March break and trying to get some of their questions done. Okay, so we're going to tackle activating background knowledge. This is one I think is the easiest, and oftentimes people just don't realize that it's a helpful thing to do. Um, Activating background knowledge is just when you take the time to deliberately think about and remember what you know about a certain topic or event before you start reading. And it can also be done after you read a chapter when you're trying to look back and understand what is happening. And again, we do this all the time in everyday life. If your boss suddenly said, hey, by the way, you've got a meeting tomorrow with Mr. Smith about such and such topic, you would immediately begin thinking about, hey, what do I know about that topic? What do I know about Mr. Smith? How can I prepare for this meeting? And all we're doing is having those same kind of thoughts, but in relationship to the events in a book. So this particular story, Where the Rivers Meet, is set on a reservation that is near a small town. And both the town and the reservations share the same school. I think many of you may have experienced similar situations and can imagine what that is like. I have lots of students write about what it was like to go to Sioux North when they lived close by in Frenchman's Head, or some of the different reserves that are down here. Um, there is clearly some ongoing issues with racism and inequalities in this book, and also in our area, which many of you may have also faced and had to deal with specifically in a school environment, right? Because part of this book is about a school. Thinking about some of those things that you faced before or during or after you read can help you understand the characters and possible problems they might face. And if it wasn't a thing for you, maybe some of your friends or maybe your parents also experienced some of those kind of things, and you can use that kind of information to help predict and understand better what our character is going through. So activating background knowledge is also really, really linked to the idea of making connections. And there's three common ways to make connections. And one is text to self, connecting the things that happen in the book to things that have happened in your own real life, like we were just talking about. Text to text, connecting things in the book to things that have happened in other books you've read. For example, maybe you've read other books about characters in schools, and you're comparing what happens to this character compared to what happened in a different character in a school. Text to the world, connecting things in this book to things that have happened in the real world, which again, we kind of talked about a little bit in activating background knowledge, which is why I think it's such a great one to start with. Now, the purpose of making these connections is not to try and find places where you or another book or a real world situation is exactly the same. Like we're not playing memory and trying to make matches. Instead, we're trying to pull on our knowledge and our feelings and use our awareness of these other sources of information and experience to help us understand the novel, the character, the events, and the choices they're making. Um, I'm going to touch on this one more. If people who love reading, I find kind of do this automatically and don't even realize. Sometimes people who don't like reading, it's often because they're not linking what they're reading. It's like it's just pointless. There's nothing they're doing. I don't know why I'm reading this. It has nothing to do with my life. It's just boring. But when you begin to make connections between yourself and the characters, it begins to be less boring because you see the similarities. And for some people, they find that it kind of helps them understand themselves better, almost in a sense, when they see the characters and what they're going through. And they're like, hey, I've been through that too. And it gives them options and ways to resolve sometimes the things that they've thought or gone through in a different way, right? Because we don't always talk about what we go through in a meaningful, deep way with everybody we know, right? Some things are just very personal and private. But when we're reading a novel, the novelist is writing as if they're that person and talking on that deep, deep, intimate level. And sometimes it just can be a really, I don't know, a healing thing, I think, to read about characters who've gone through some of the same tough things that we've gone through. Because this assignment specifically asks for your opinion on the chapter that you choose, I think that making connections is a really valuable strategy to use. And it works very well to help you have opinions on what has happened and what you think might happen in a book. All right. So first we're going to talk about making connections to yourself. I think this is the easiest one, and I think people often do this automatically without even realizing they're doing it. It's a very big category. So it can be a connection to something that you've experienced, like a similar event, such as a death, a serious illness, divorce, moving, trauma, abuse. It can also relate to the type of feeling a character is having. Like maybe you haven't gone through a death, but you know what it feels like to be sad. Maybe you haven't had your parents divorce, but you can understand what it feels like to be, missing one parent and living with another parent because maybe you had a parent go away for a while. So it doesn't have to be the exact same type of situation. Sometimes people get really kind of hung up on that or like, well, I've never had that happen to me. No, but maybe you felt frightened or embarrassed or sad or excited or worried, and you can connect to what the character is going through the similar emotions. You can also relate to having experiences with a similar setting. Sometimes just living in a certain kind of place creates similar experiences and events that are kind of like the backdrop to our own lives. So the hardships of living in the North, the difficulties of life in a desert, the dangers in a big city, the boredom in a small town. Those are all things that you might connect to with a character. So an example of writing about a character to yourself might sound like this. Now, this is not based on our book. This is kind of just me pretending to have a connection to an imaginary book to get the idea across. So here I am. I can understand what this boy is feeling after the death of his mother because I have lost a parent as well. In my case, it was my father I lost. His friends don't understand him because he seems angry instead of sad. They don't realize that the anger is a cover up for the sadness he feels inside. I remember feeling that way, as if the sadness would break me into pieces if I let people see it. So, this is one example of making a connection to yourself. Okay. You can also make connections to another book. I am not specifically asking anybody to do that. But if you are someone who reads a lot, you may have read a lot of stories about, um, teenage girls being at a school or Indigenous people facing racism. And maybe you're automatically just making some connections to other books that you've read and you want to share that. That's totally valid and useful if you want to do that in your journal. Um, Sometimes the characters might be going through similar events, like teenage girl who's in a school where she is a minority. And you just find yourself mentally comparing and contrasting how the two different characters handle similar situation. Other times the characters might be very similar, like they're not just what's around them, but their personality and their character. but they have different friends, different family, different events, so that their experiences by the end of the novel might be very different. So, like example, maybe in one book you've read, the girl has no family, right? Her parents have died. She's living with her aunts. And every time she's going through experiences, part of what's happening is she doesn't have her parents to be able to rely on and help her. And then in another novel where some similar things might be happening and similar characters, but in that novel, the character has parents and the parents are helping to guide her and protect her and that kind of thing. So then you're comparing how that's one small difference is making a huge difference in the character's life. Also, having familiarity with a certain genre can sometimes help you make predictions about what might happen next. And this is where I'm talking about if you read a lot and you've read a lot of books on Indigenous characters going to school, you may already have a lot of ideas about what's going to happen next in this book. So, for example, I've watched enough crime shows to know that if I see a pretty girl walking through a dark parking lot in the first minute of a TV show, there's a really strong chance that girl's about to get attacked, raped, abducted, or killed, right? I just know that because it's part of um, the pattern, I guess, of what happens in crime shows. So, one thing to think about while you're writing your journals is when you were reading this book, did you find that you made any connections to other books that you may have read that had similar characters or similar kind of circumstances? Making connections to the world. Making connections to the world happens when you compare what is happening in the book to real life events, even if they didn't happen to you. And this is, I think, a big one because sometimes people get really sort of stuck on, I don't know how to relate to this character because everything that's happening to them is so different from my life, right? But if I've read a book about a child in war, I can have some understanding of what he might be going through from my knowledge above news reports about children in war. And so I can begin to relate to and understand what that child might be going through, even though I've never been near a war myself. So in this book, the main character is already conveying some of the racism and the unfairness that's around her. And you may have experienced some of these things yourself. But even if you hadn't, you've probably had friends or family who've gone through these types of events. And understanding what real people have gone through can be a way to understand what an imaginary character is going through or might end up going through by the end of the book. So, did the memories and the feelings that Nancy shares and discusses in the first chapter remind you of any real world events that might have happened in your community, to your parents, to your friends? And did thinking about those events that happen in the real world help you understand Nancy better and her situation better? Okay. The other big thing is we're not looking for you just to summarize what happened in the chapter, right? I'm looking for you to show your opinion about what happened in the chapter. So we often use certain words or phrases at the beginning of a sentence to make it clear to the reader that we're only stating our opinions. We're not saying facts. And some of those examples are words like I believe, I think, I feel. In my opinion, it is my belief that I imagine, I wonder. All of those are showing that it's your personal response to the events. So, for example, maybe you're reading a book about a girl who has been being abused by her boyfriend. And you're saying, I believe that in a situation like that, a girl should leave the guy. She shouldn't stick around because he's only going to keep on doing that. In the book, he's promising this, but I know from real life that most of my friends who've been through that, they didn't keep their promises. And I think that therefore, this character probably isn't going to keep their promises as well. So you are discussing what happened in the book, but you're discussing what you believe and what you think and feel about what happened in the book. So it's a little bit deeper, kind of. It's kind of like a two-level thing here. So this is what I'm talking about, supporting your opinion with details. So it's really important when you're writing your opinion about a text that you include both your opinion and specific details from the text. If you only do one, like only your opinion or only specific details, you aren't really engaging with the text in the way that we're asking you to. I'm going to use an example from a movie so I don't do the work for you from the text. In my opinion, Loki is not evil. So Loki from the Avengers movies, right? And he's kind of portrayed as the villain. So this is me arguing against that and kind of saying how I think of it differently. He does do some really bad things, such as invite the aliens to invade Earth. However, he seems more mischievous to me. He is always looking for ways to enjoy himself. He is not necessarily looking to harm people. For example, when he commands the people to kneel before him in that one scene, it is because he craves attention and adoration. However, if he were truly evil, he would have simply destroyed them all instead. This is kind of the beginning of a journal. It would need more sentences if I was going to hand this in, but this is an example of how I choose details from the actual text or movie, but then I explain my feelings and ideas in response to them. Okay. It's that kind of connection. Also, remember to use good paragraph format in your chapter journals. There should always be an introductory sentence kind of explaining your big idea. There should be several supporting sentences for the body of the paragraph, often at least 3 to 5 sentences that are kind of supporting your main idea. And then there's usually a closing sentence that restates your opening. So here is a spot for like a sample chapter reflection. I'm going to just tackle, do we have time? I'm going to tackle chapter 1 because we read it together yesterday. And see what we, here we go, chapter 1. So one of the things I was thinking about yesterday was that as I was reading that that first chapter out loud, it was interesting because when I read that chapter before on my own, I remember being so frustrated and so bored by the scene where she's just walking along the railroad at first. And until we got to the part where they were talking about the auntie and how she had died, I didn't understand why the author was dragging that part out. It seemed really just pointless and tedious. It was like, oh, can he get to something important? But then as I was reading it again yesterday, and there's a spot where the writer is talking about how she's swaying back and forth, standing on that railroad that is 1,000 feet up from the gorge below. And I began to feel kind of like a mama thing towards this teenager where I was like, oh, you know what? I missed this the first time. It almost feels to me like, even though they're not saying it, like this girl is maybe thinking about harming herself, about um, what would happen if I didn't walk across? What would happen if I did let myself fall? And I didn't catch that the first time. And I'm not even 100% convinced that that is what the writer intended, but it really hit me strongly yesterday. So I'm going to write about that part because um, once I got that, it really changed how I read the rest of that chapter for me. And I don't know if you felt the same way or if when you saw it, you were just like, oh, same kind of thing. I don't always like the parts where there's lots of description. I always like where there's lots of dialogue and action. It's kind of a failing of mine as a reader for sure, but it definitely is a preference of mine. So I feel like I missed something the first time through and I got it more the second time through. So how do I state my opinion? So let me see. This chapter was a bit confusing to me because my first response and my second response to the chapter were completely different. Initially, I thought the chapter started in a very boring way. I couldn't figure out why. The writer just had the girl walking very slowly along the train tracks. I kept waiting for something to happen, but it didn't really occur. She does have the memory of her aunt's death. But when I read it through a second time, I began to feel anxious for the main character. The way she was swaying on the bridge made me concerned that she was either suicidal or maybe just didn't value her life very much. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second. So I want to point out some parts are my opinion. It was confusing to me. Initially, I thought it was boring, but then I link it to actual events. The girl's walking slowly along the train tracks. She has the memory of her aunt's death. But then I began to talk about some of my ideas. And some of these ideas, someone else who read that chapter might not have the same opinion or the same feelings, and that is totally valid. So that's the kind of thing we're looking for, where you're combining your thoughts and your opinions with the actual events. Now, the one thing this paragraph is missing is it does not have a closing sentence. And I would want to count the sentences to make sure it actually had enough. I forget if it wanted 5 or 6. Um, I am really particular about that. If I think a paragraph is too short, I will absolutely go through and start counting the sentences to see. So remember that we're looking for periods, not just lines. If it's 6 lines long, but it's only 3 sentences, that is not long enough. It needs to have 6 whole sentences, okay? So my closing thing would be going back to the fact that I had 2 different responses. So now I value the first part of this chapter more because I realized the author was trying to hint at some of the scenes and emotions that are coming in the rest of the chapter in the book. Coming? Yeah, I've got the wrong word here. Coming in the rest of the book. Okay. So is that perfect? No, it's absolutely not perfect. It's very fast. But you can see it didn't take me very long. Now, before I handed that in, I would go back through. I would probably add some details. I would check my spelling. I would check for capitals. I would check my sentences. All that kind of thing I would begin to look through before I handed it in. But the initial writing didn't take that long, right? That's though why I was talking about having a little notebook next to you and kind of writing down ideas as they come to you. Because then, like, let's say you're reading the chapter and you're writing down some ideas, and then something happens at your house. You know, your auntie knocks at the door, you got to go help her do something. By the time you get back, you're putting the kids to bed. All of a sudden, it's the next day before you get to look at what you were writing, and you may have forgotten it by that time. But because you've written it down, now you've got some ideas to work with. So I really, really encourage you as you're reading these chapters, write down your ideas so that if something happens, you've got those ideas right there and can come back to them. Okay. That is just talking about how to do the reflections. Now I'm going back to K23 because now we're looking at chapter 2. Chapter 2 runs from page 7 to page 15, and it has several questions to start off. I don't know why they all say number one. I don't think they do in your unit. I think that was just a weird formatting error in PowerPoint. Hang on, let me just grab them and see if I can fix that really quick. I don't know why. Nope, I'm gonna undo that. All right. Number one, describe the local school as Nancy views it, not how we see it, but how does she see it? Number two, what is the name of Nancy's school? Number three, who is Donut Stevenson? Why is she usually upset with Nancy? Why is Quigley the teacher that Nancy and the other students dislike the most? Who is Mark Bateman? Why does Nancy have a problem with him? Why does Nancy look up to Bernice Wu, her home economics teacher? Okay, so I'm going to start looking at chapter 2. But what I'm going to do today, which is different than yesterday, is I'm going to stop as I read and kind of do what we call a think out loud. Because what happens sometimes is we can't see the process that other people are going through as they're reading because it's all going on silently inside their head. So what I'm going to do is kind of try to share what I'm thinking as I'm reading to kind of show you what I'm talking about in terms of having ideas and thoughts that you want to write down. So hopefully this works. I'll try to make it really clear when I'm switching from what the chapter says to what I'm thinking, because I know some people are doing this through radio, so it might not be as obvious as if you're doing this through Zoom and you can see my actual screen. Okay, so remember that when we last left Nancy, her friend had dropped her off at the school that she absolutely did not want to go to. So here she's kind of finally going into the school. Entering the school was like climbing through the mouth of the old mine shaft out of by Marble Lake. Nancy had once entered it on a dare. In the building, sunlight was replaced by gloomy corridors, lit by the glare of fluorescent lights, and the warmth of the day was replaced with a metallic coldness. Somewhere down behind mysterious locked doors, deep in the basement, a giant air conditioner was methodically refrigerating the place. Nancy could almost see frost forming on the walls. She thought she could feel the floors throbbing to the soundless hum of the thing. Wow, the writers really made it clear how unhappy Nancy is without ever describing her feelings. Outside is sunlight, inside is gloomy corridors. Outside is warmth, inside it's cold and it's metallic. Um, when she talks about frost forming on the walls, I just almost pictured her like imprisoned in a refrigerator. She stood inside the door uncertainly. On her left were the yellow doors into the gym, and to her right was the hallway with its bright orange doors into the stark cinder block and vinyl classrooms. In front of her in the office, Donut Stevenson was sitting grimly behind the glass as she pounded on typewriter keys. She was the school secretary, and as long as anyone could remember, she'd worn her graying hair pulled back in the thick bun that gave her the nickname. Okay, so I'm pretty sure Donut Stevenson was one of the questions they asked, and I would go back and check that right now. That's why we read the questions ahead of time to sort of know what we were looking for. Nancy could try to sneak by her and get into the classroom without being seen, but she had biology first period, Quigley, and that was bad news. He would be sure to mark her late, and then she would be called down to the office to face charges of being late and neglecting to sign in. It was better to face Donut's wrath now than on a double rap later. So I'm assuming Quigley is another teacher, although they don't say Mr. or Mrs. Quigley. Oh, it's a he too, because it says he. Nancy walked through the door into the office and up to the counter. Donut refused to acknowledge her and continued attacking the typewriter as though it had offended her in some way. Nancy slapped her books down loudly. I am aware of your presence, Miss Antoine, Donut snapped in her clipped English accent. There is no need to bang about. Nancy bit back a reply and stood mutely. Finally, Donut ripped the paper out of the typewriter and slammed it down on the table. She stood up and eyed Nancy with distaste. Late again, Miss Antoine? The sixth time this month. What's your excuse today? Something flared in Nancy, and she heard herself say, Oh, well, I had a breakfast meeting with the Prime Minister. It kind of makes me laugh. I have definitely come across secretaries like this where they're kind of like the gatekeeper of the school and they really enjoy using their power over students. Donut's eyes grew wide, then narrowed dangerously. A red rash crept up her neck. Don't you get impertinent with me, she hissed. I can have you out of here so fast it'll take your breath away. Nancy knew she wasn't kidding. It was Donut who ran the school, not Mr. Patterson, the principal. He cowered behind his closed doors most of the day, emerging only to hand a letter to Donut or pick up a memo. He viewed the world through his secretary's eyes. If she wanted Nancy out, all Donut needed to do was feed him some acid comments about Nancy's attendance and behavior, and she was a goner. Nancy lowered her eyes and mumbled an apology. Sorry, Miss Stevenson. It's been a hard week. Donut nodded slightly. That's better. Now sign in. Any more unexcused absences this month will be reported to Mr. Patterson. Nancy quickly signed the sheet in the black binder and picked up her books. As she walked down the hall, she fought back the angry tears that welled in her eyes. Finding herself in front of her classroom, she hesitated before opening the door and steeled herself for Quigley's remarks. Quigley was probably the most hated person at Creighton Secondary. It wasn't just that he ran the dullest classroom in the school, or even that he was nasty to the point of being cruel. There was something even more insidious about the man. Whatever she could say about the other teachers in the school, Nancy at least felt that in their own way, they wanted their students to learn to succeed. They may not have the vaguest idea of how to relate to the students, and their lectures might have all the zip and freshness of flat beer, but at least they hoped their students would do well. But Quigley was different. He seemed to delight in failing students, especially Indian students. He bullied and intimidated, harrying Indian pupils into withdrawal as if he needed to constantly prove his own dark bigotries through their failure. Now, I always worry about using language that might be perceived as a slur, so I apologize. I'm reading what's actually there on the text. And I know some people don't consider that, they just consider that descriptive. So, um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to handle that particular part of this novel. It's just kind of there. Um, like last week when he had confronted Amanda Johnny in class, he had collected papers that were due that day, and Amanda's wasn't there. He stalked down the aisle and stood over her like some livid demon. Where is your paper, young lady? Have you ever gotten a paper in on time? Amanda sat quietly and stared at her desk, which seemed to enrage Quigley even more. Answer me when I ask a question, he screamed, pounding on the desk with his fist. And look at me when I'm speaking to you. Amanda sat as rigid as stone, and Quigley flew into an absolute rage. His usually ruddy face flushed a bright crimson, the veins in his broad forehead standing out like thick strings. I will not tolerate disrespect and insolence in my classroom, he raged, thrusting his face inches from hers. If you do not look at me and answer me this instant, I will have you suspended from school. Nancy had felt her stomach tighten until it hurt. She looked around the room, but everyone's eyes were averted. Amanda suffered, totally alone, humiliated and powerless. But just as horrible was the inaction of the class and of Nancy. She desperately wanted to stop the ordeal, but she too sat watching in agony, silent. Finally, even Quigley had had enough. Amanda had never shown the slightest response. He stood up and pointed at the door. Get out, he snarled, now. Amanda had quickly picked up her books and slunk quietly through the door. Quigley had gotten her suspended for 2 days, but Amanda would never be back. One thought kept pounding in Nancy's head. We were all too scared to lift a finger to stop the pain. Now she opened the door as quietly as possible and slipped towards her seat. Quigley had his back to her as he scribbled the parts of a fish on a diagram drawn on the board. Each student had an identical diagram on a sheet of paper and were dutifully copying down the parts, anterior, posterior, lateral, ventral, as Quigley wrote them on the board. She glanced down at Tom Charlie's paper and noticed that he had drawn a bra on his fish and had a balloon coming out of its mouth. When the going gets tough, he had written, the tough go fishing. Nancy tried to stifle a giggle, but it was too late. She'd been noticed. Now the writer has taken a really long time just literally to get Nancy in the door because he's written this kind of flashback scene describing previous times that this teacher had been mean and why Nancy's feeling so nervous and scared basically to kind of walk in the door. So if you weren't aware that was a flashback, that might be kind of confusing, right? But it's her remembering things. They don't quite say it that way as clear, but that's what's going on. Quigley whirled around from the board and placed his hands on the back of his chair. He leaned forward, thrusting his big raw face towards her. Even across the room, she could see the network of veins in his ruddy cheeks and the bushy eyebrows that hung like partially drawn curtains over the tiny, deep-set eyes. He jabbed the chalk at her. I see that it's not enough, he sputtered, to insult me and the rest of the class by arriving late. But now that you have condescended to attend, you insist on disturbing the other students with your inane giggling. Sit down, Miss Antoine, and I'll see you after school. Like H, you will, thought Nancy as she slid into her seat and opened her biology book. There was yet another diagram of a fish, all parts color-coded. Geez, she thought, when it comes to things that are really important, like the parts of a fish, you just can't repeat them too much. The period crawled by with agonizing slowness. Nancy felt her head pitch forward as she dozed off. She caught herself before slamming into the hard Formica desktop, but almost immediately her eyes began to droop again. She tried desperately to find some kind of diversion, but it was impossible to make contact with other students. They either gazed numbly into space or stared with unfocused eyes at their books. She tried to study the mountains through the narrow window slots at each end of the room, but all she could see was the bank of raw dirt outside that one day might be landscaped. My God, she thought, it's only 9:15. One thing that I'm noticing here is the teacher's making no attempt to like interact with the students, to ask questions, to have them respond. And when she talks about um, trying to see the mountain through the narrow window slots, it totally made me think about like a prison cell. And you know how there's those bars dividing up the window, at least in movies, I don't know. And then it makes me think that almost like she's in a prison in a sense. Nancy practically sprinted for the hall when the period had mercifully dragged to an end. Leaning up against the lockers, she squeezed her eyes shut. How much longer could she stand this? She sensed someone standing in front of her and opened her eyes a crack. Even between her lasses, she recognized the unmistakable bulk and shock of blonde hair. Mark Bateman, basketball star, class valedictorian, and general creep, was trying to hit on her again. What's the trouble, baby? Mark said, clenching and unclenching his fists and slowly rotating his massive shoulders as though he were on a dance floor. Old Quigley give you a rough time? Mark, I don't know who's a bigger geek, you or Quigley. Mark feigned a hurt expression. Now, is that any way to talk to a guy you're going out with this Saturday? Mark, how can I make it clear? I not only don't want to go out with you, it disturbs me that we have to share the same planet. One of the best reasons to leave this town, and there are lots of good ones, is to avoid your arrogant, bumbling attempts at charm. Nancy turned and started down the hall. You just don't know what you're missing, he called after her. I can hardly stand the suspense, muttered Nancy. Okay, I'm going to stop there because we're running close on time. Hang on a second. Okay, my apologies there. Going back to the questions, we already have some answers to the questions that they're asking. How does Nancy view the local school? What is the name of her school? Who is Donut Stevenson? And why is she usually upset with Nancy? Why is Quigley the teacher that Nancy and the other students dislike the most? Who is Mark Bateman? And why does Nancy have a problem with him? The only question we haven't seen an answer to yet is, why does Nancy look up to Bernice Wu, her home economics teacher? Sorry, my apologies, got a little coughing fit here. Remember to write in complete sentences, not in one-word answers. For example, if somebody asked you who's your teacher, a complete sentence would be, my teacher is Jillian Percy. We often use the end of the question to start our answer. Where do you live? I live in Sioux Lookout. Pay attention to how many marks the question is worth. For example, if a question looks like this, who is Mr. Hardening? And there's a 1, the 1 stands for the marks, and they just need a simple answer. Mr. Hardening is the history teacher. But another question that may look very similar is actually asking for more complex information and may need more sentences. Why does Trevor like Mr. Hardening? 2. So I need to write at least 2 sentences then, probably. Trevor likes Mr. Hardening because he teaches his favorite subject, math. He is also very laid back and makes lots of jokes with the kids. So Trevor feels comfortable in his class. Okay. So we looked today at chapter 2 and the questions for chapter 2. And we looked at how to write a journal reflection on a chapter. So try to get started on those a little bit tonight. And we will talk some more about that kind of thing tomorrow and different types of reading strategies. Okay. Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you guys tomorrow.